Part 1, Chapter 1, A Shifting Reef. The year 1866 was marked by a strange event, an unexplainable occurrence which is undoubtedly still fresh in everyone's memory. Those living in coastal towns or in the interior of continents were aroused by all sorts of rumors, but it was seafaring people who were particularly excited. Merchants, ship owners, captains, skippers, and masters of Europe and America, naval officers of all countries and the various governments of both continents were deeply concerned over the matter. Several ships had recently met at sea an enormous thing, a long, slender object which was sometimes phosphorescent and which was infinitely larger and faster than a whale. The facts concerning this apparition entered in various logbooks agreed closely with one another as to the structure of the object or creature in question, the incredible speed of its movements, the surprising power of its locomotion, and the strange life with which it seemed endowed. If it was a member of the whale family, it was larger than any so far classified by scientists. Neither Cuvier, Lacépède, Dumeril, nor Quatrefages would have admitted that such a monster could exist, unless they'd seen it with their own scientists' eyes. Taking an average of observations made at different times and rejecting those timid evaluations which said the object was only 200 feet long, and also putting aside those exaggerated opinions which said it was a mile wide and 3 miles long, one could nevertheless conclude that this phenomenal creature was considerably larger than anything at that time recognized by ichthyologists, if it existed at all. But it did exist. There was no denying this fact any longer, and considering the natural inclination of the human brain toward objects of wonder, one can understand the excitement produced throughout the world by this supernatural apparition. In any case, the idea of putting it into the realm of fiction had to be abandoned. On July 20th, 1866, the steamer Governor Higginson of the Calcutta and Burnock Steam Navigation Company had encountered this moving mass 5 miles east of the Australian coast. Captain Baker first thought he had sighted an unknown reef. He was even getting ready to plot its exact position when 2 columns of water spurted out of the inexplicable object and rose with a loud whistling noise to a height of 150 feet. So unless the reef contained a geyser, the Governor Higginson was quite simply in the presence of an unknown aquatic mammal spurting columns of water mixed with air and vapor out of its blowholes. A similar thing was observed on July 23rd of the same year in Pacific waters by Christopher Columbus of the West India and Pacific Steam Navigation Company. This extraordinary creature could therefore move from one place to another with surprising speed, since within a space of only 3 days, the Governor Higginson and the Christopher Columbus had sighted it at 2 points on the globe separated by more than 1,500 nautical miles. 2 weeks later, and 4,300 miles from this last spot, the Helvetia of the Compagnie Nationale and the Shannon of the Royal Mail Steamship Company, passing on opposite courses in that part of the Atlantic lying between the United States and Europe, signaled one another that they had sighted the monster at 42 degrees 15 north latitude and 60 degrees 35 west longitude. In this simultaneous observation, they felt able to judge the creature's minimum length at more than 350 feet, since it was larger than both ships, each of which measured 330 feet overall. But the largest whales, the Coulommic and Umgullic, which live in the waters around the Aleutian Islands, never exceed 180 feet in length, if that much. These reports arriving one after the other, with fresh observations made on board the liner La Perriere, a collision between the Etna of the Inman line and the monster, an official report drawn up by the officers of the French frigate Normandie, and a very reliable sighting made by Commodore Fitzjames' staff on board the Lord Clyde, greatly stirred public opinion. In light-hearted countries, people made jokes about it, but in serious, practical-minded countries such as England, America, and Germany, it was a matter of grave concern. In every big city, the monster became the fashion. It was sung about in cafes, derided in newspapers, and discussed on the stage. Scandal sheets had a marvelous opportunity to print all kinds of wild stories. Even ordinary newspapers, always short of copy, printed articles about every huge imaginary monster one could think of, from the white whale, the terrible Moby Dick of the far north, to the legendary Norse kraken, whose tentacles could entwine a 500-ton ship and drag it to the bottom. Reports of ancient times were mentioned. The opinions of Aristotle and Pliny, who admitted to the existence of such monsters, along with those of the Norwegian bishop Pontoppidan, Paul Hegedee, and finally Mr. Harrington, whose good faith no one can question when he claims to have seen, while on board the Castillon in 1857, that enormous serpent which until then had been seen in no waters but those of the old Paris newspaper, the Constitutionnel. It was then that in scientific societies and journals an interminable argument broke out between those who believed in the monster and those who did not. The question of the monster had everyone aroused. Newspapermen, who always pretend to be on the side of scientists and against those who live by their imagination, spilled gallons of ink during this memorable campaign, and some even spilled 2 or 3 drops of blood after arguments that had started over sea serpents and ended in the most violent personal insults. For 6 months this war was waged with varying fortune. Serious, weighty articles were published by the Brazilian Geographical Institute, the Royal Scientific Academy of Berlin, the British Association, and the Smithsonian Institute in Washington. Others appeared in the Indian Archipelago, in Abba Muigno's Cosmos, in Petermann's Mytholungen, and in the science sections of all the important newspapers of France and other countries. The smaller newspapers replied with inexhaustible energy, their writers cleverly parodying a saying of Linnaeus, which had been quoted by the adversaries of the monster, stated that nature does not make fools, and called on their contemporaries not to contradict nature by seriously discussing krakens, sea serpents, Moby Dicks, and other reports of delirious sailors. Finally, in a much-dreaded satirical newspaper, its favorite writer took care of the whole matter by attacking the monster like Hippolytus, dealing it a death blow and finishing it off in the midst of universal laughter. Wit had conquered science. During the first month of the year 1867, the whole question seemed buried, never to be revived, when new facts were brought before the public. It was no longer a question of a scientific problem to be solved, but of a real danger seriously to be avoided. The whole matter took on another aspect. The monster now became a small island, rock or reef, but a reef that was vague, shifting, and indeterminate. On March 5, 1867, the Moravian of the Montreal Ocean Company, sailing at night, struck on its starboard side a rock indicated on no chart. It had been cruising at 13 knots under the combined force of the wind and its 400 horsepower engines. Had it not been for the superior quality of its hull, the Moravian undoubtedly would have been split open by the blow and sunk with the 237 passengers it was bringing back from Canada. The accident took place at about 5 a.m. toward daybreak. The officers on watch rushed to the after part of the ship. They examined the sea carefully and saw nothing but an area of swirling water about 1/3 of a mile away, as if the surface had been violently agitated. Their position was noted, and the Moravian continued on its way, apparently without any serious damage. Had it struck a submerged rock or the enormous wreck of some sunken ship? There was no way of knowing, but an inspection of its hull and dry dock showed that part of the keel had been broken. Even this, although extremely serious in itself, might perhaps have been forgotten, like so many other occurrences, if 3 weeks later it had not been reenacted under similar circumstances. But because of the nationality of the ship involved in this new collision and the reputation of the company to which it belonged, this event caused a tremendous stir. There's no one who has not heard of the famous English shipowner Cunard. In 1840, this shrewd businessman started a postal service between Liverpool and Halifax with 3 wooden side-wheel ships of 1,162 tons each and equipped with engines capable of developing 400 horsepower. 8 years later, the company's fleet was increased by 4 ships of 1,820 tons each and with 650 horsepower engines, and then 2 years after this, by 2 other vessels with yet greater tonnage and power. In 1853, the Cunard Line, whose mail-carrying privileges had just been renewed, successively added to its fleet the Arabia, the Persia, the China, the Scotia, the Java, and the Russia, all of them very fast and larger than any ships which had ever plied the seas, except for the Great Eastern. Thus, in 1867, the company owned 12 ships, 8 with side wheels and 4 with propellers. If I give these brief details, it is so that everyone might know the importance of this ship company, known the world over for the intelligent way in which it is run. No transoceanic venture has been more cleverly organized, and none crowned with such success. In 26 years, Cunard ships have crossed the Atlantic 2,000 times without missing a single voyage, with never a delay, and without ever losing a single letter, man, or ship. This is why passengers, in spite of strong competition from French liners, still choose the Cunard line in preference to all others, as would appear from a survey of official documents of the last few years. No one, therefore, will be surprised at the stir caused by an accident involving one of its finest steamers. On April 13th, 1867, the Scotia was sailing and on a clear sea with a moderate breeze. It was traveling at a speed of 13.43 knots, propelled by its 1,000-horsepower engines. Its side wheels were striking the water in regular rhythm. It was then drawing 22 feet of water with a displacement of 233,900 cubic feet. At 4:17 in the afternoon, while the passengers were gathered in the big lounge having their tea, a slight blow was felt against the hull of the Scotia, on the quarter slightly behind the port wheel. The Scotia had not struck something, it had been struck, and by some object which was more cutting or perforating than blunt. The blow had seemed so slight that nobody on board would have given it a second thought, had not the men working below rushed up onto the bridge and shouted, "We're sinking! We're sinking!" At first the passengers were very frightened, but Captain Anderson quickly reassured them, for there was no real danger. The Scotia was divided into 7 watertight compartments and could therefore face any leak with impunity. Captain Anderson immediately went down into the hold. He found the 5th compartment flooded, and the speed with which this had happened proved that the leak was considerable. Fortunately, this compartment did not contain the boilers, for then the fires would have gone out immediately. Captain Anderson ordered the engine stopped at once, and one of the sailors dove to find out the extent of the damage. He soon discovered there was a hole 6 feet across in the hull of the steamer, but such a hole could not be plugged up, and so the Scotia had to continue its voyage, with its side wheels half submerged. She was then 300 miles from Cape Clear, and finally, 3 days behind schedule, a delay which caused great uneasiness in Liverpool, she came alongside the company docks. After putting her in dry dock, engineers inspected the Scotia. They could not believe their eyes. 8 feet below her waterline, there was a neat hole in the form of an isosceles triangle. It was so perfectly shaped that it could scarcely have been done better with a precision instrument. The object which had made this hole must have been extremely unusual, and after being driven into the ship with prodigious force, enough to pierce a hull 1½ inches thick, it must have withdrawn by itself in a manner completely unexplainable. This new event once again stirred up public opinion. From then on, all unexplained losses at sea were attributed to the monster. This fantastic animal bore the responsibility for all such shipwrecks, which unfortunately are not few in number, for of the 3,000 ships reported sunk each year by the Bureau Veritas, the number of steam and sailing ships assumed to be lost with all hands through absence of any news amounts to no less than 200. And it was the monster who, rightly or wrongly, was held responsible for their disappearance and for the increasing danger of traveling between various continents, to the point where the public came out with a categoric demand that the seas be rid of this formidable creature at any price.